You ready?
Here we are.
Okay. You're listening to 54665, all things rural economic development, all things small business, and all things Viroqua. We have with us today a very special guest, author David Levin. He's written The Raise Your Game and also co-authored Question Behind the Question. Am I correct?
Yep.
And we're here today. I think this is going to be a really fantastic podcast because we're going to break this into a couple different segments for you because there's some really, really good information. If you haven't checked it out, Raise Your Inner Game. It's a fantastic and compact book that really helps you overcome stress and distraction. And the purpose is to work at your highest level and literally be in your life and have that be a moment that you're proud of. So welcome, David. Thanks for coming to the studio this morning.
Thank you. Super happy to be here.
I'm just very excited that we have our first guest here who is in Wikipedia. So it's very exciting that felt very monumental to me. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow.
You know, I can honestly say
that is cool. I checked right away. And
I can
he was
honestly
there.
say like that's a. And this is going to sound so narcissistic, but this is a life goal of mine to be in Wikipedia someday.
I checked for you.
I know, I'm not there.
I'm not yet.
How do you
we'll
think
work
you should
on it.
be?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that vote of confidence, but like that is once upon a time the Wikipedia. This is how sad and self-absorbed this really gets. we could go through this all day, but like I checked to see the notable people from Viroqua on the Viroqua Wikipedia page, and I've never made it. James Beard nomination, everything aside, like you just, man, to get to that stage.
That's why the podcast journey is gonna push you over the top, I think.
That would be amazing if I make it for the podcast work. Like,
right?
That would be beautiful.
Right?
Great. So, David, you're a resident of Viroqua.
I am 8 years and counting now.
How did you get here?
Okay, our story is we followed family. Margaret, my wife's Margaret, her brother Joe. They're our closest family. They're the closest siblings in their family, and they have kids the same age as ours. And we moved back to Minneapolis. I would say 90. Okay, I'm forgetting the year. It's too early in the day for me to remember years. Anyway, they're both raised in the cities. We left in '99 for 3 years, so I guess it was 2002 we came back. And just to give you an idea of how close we were, we chose to live as close to them as possible as we could in the cities. We were like 3 or 4 blocks away. And that was great. And then they left. And they came to Viroqua.
Sure.
And we just missed them terribly. We'd come down and visit. And we were like, oh, man, everything felt better when we were around those guys. So then around 2002, no, I was not right, 2010, my last record had just come out, 2009, I guess. And So one of the things that kept me in the cities was the music career. And then when that last record came out, I was finally feeling like, I really could be done with this now. And we were starting to get to that point where we were feeling the extra burden of being parents in a really dense metro environment. Mm-hmm. So we're like, I guess we could go. So as soon as that clicked, we were like, okay, we could leave here now. Where following those guys was the only thing that made sense. So we came down and we checked it out. And of course, the Waldorf School was a big thing too. Peter was still in pre-K, but we were planning to go to the City of Lakes, Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we followed them. And so we bought a house a block away from them on Rusk. And within a year, they moved again.
Thank you.
They went
very
out of the
little.
country.
Yeah.
They're like, they like us, but not that much.
Right.
Yeah. But no, it's been great.
Great. That's awesome.
So this doesn't have a tremendous amount to do with what we're going to chat about today, but as far as the Minneapolis music scene, did you ever hang out with Paul Westerberg or anything like that?
I didn't.
I had to
hang
ask
out
that
with-
question.
No, I appreciate it. I expected you were going to ask the Prince question.
Or
Because
that,
people farther
Prince
out ask
too,
that one.
right? Yeah.
I actually didn't. It's really interesting. Maybe it's a mark of the size of the scene there. But you can be, active, you can be doing it full time, and you can still not know most of the people in the scene.
Sure.
Because they were completely different worlds. The Prince, Time sort of world was one. Like I knew guys who were in there, but I didn't know the core guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the 7th Street Entry sort of kind of world. I was always more of a pop kind of guy.
Yep.
So I just moved in different circles.
What is that like, kind of coming into, because there are, this is a very musician dense community, I would say. And to varying degrees of success. Do you find like this is a good community to foster that, or is that one of those things that you kind of take on and you're a one-man wolf pack as far as that's concerned?
The truth is, when we came down, I haven't done a thing since we left. And I just really set it aside. I think about it now and then, but I haven't engaged in any kind of way. I hardly ever get out. Our kids are still young enough. Like I never get out to the bookstore. Yeah. I almost never see shows. I'm just very dimly aware. I mean, I made the Cloud Cult show, but that hardly counts. We all did that.
Yeah,
right?
everybody does.
But no, I honestly don't know.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting.
I think we should start a band.
Really?
Do you play?
Yeah.
What do you play?
Guitar, piano, violin, drums.
Wow. Multi-instrumentalist.
Mm-hmm.
I actually started college in Chicago I wanted to be a rock star, and was heavily influenced by Butch Vig being from this place. So I decided I was going to go to school to do soundtracking for films. And in that process, I got really, really into, man, I don't know if I should say this, but I got really into making dance music, like electronica. And so I actually dropped out of college for a while because we were recording and touring a lot and doing a lot of clubs. And at the time it was raves. So that completely dates me. But, we, oh, you just let, if we ever wanted to throw together like a dance party band, I'm down.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
We call ourselves the 665.
The 665s, exactly.
So amazing.
Oh, boy.
So like what year kind of range was that?
1998 to about 2000, 2001.
And so how did that was your main interest?
Yep.
Rockstar.
Yep, Rockstar.
Music world.
Rockstar music world.
How did you end up cooking?
Sure, that's a good question. Kind of realizing like the sustainability of like trying to be a professional musician, it's exhausting.
Exhausting.
You're chasing constantly that next piece. So I actually decided that I was going to take a hiatus from making music, and I was fortunate enough to be in Madison at the time, and got involved at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was taking classes there. And I was looking for this transition into something that I could do that was intellectually stimulating, that was relatively creative. So I decided I was going to become an attorney, and went down that path. And then I actually got to the brink of like, okay, this is it. This is the buy-in. And the only thing that really made sense to me at that point in time that felt like it was emotionally secure was cooking food. I had been working in restaurants, and that was really gratifying and satisfying to me. And I had been around some chefs who were very intellectual and really approached food with, a very intuitive, sort of mindset. And that was my wake up call. Like, this is what I should do. Plus the identity of being from this place, which is very, very organic farm dense. It gave me that identity. This is who I am. This is where I'm from, and this is part of my story. So, that's a lot of what I talk about, even on this podcast, is that identity piece. What does it mean to be from this place, and where is it going? But that being said, you switching gears, a musician, you found yourself in Viroqua. You found yourself at this point in your life. When did you start formulating these ideas for your writing career?
Well, being in that world generally, speaking and writing and training and that stuff, it's sort of tangentially, sort of similar to the story you just told. I've been a musician all my life. As a result of that, I had a studio in my house back in Minneapolis, and I'd been waiting tables for a long time, and I was in a new band called the Screaming Yahoos. This was pre-internet, so Yahoo wasn't a thing yet.
Should have bought the domain name.
Right, exactly.
Really,
we'd be having a much different conversation today.
That's good. So I was getting to that point where there's some tension that every time I would go gig, it was costing me too much money because I was also waiting tables at night. So I needed another way to make some money. I
Right.
started doing audio production for professional speakers. I didn't know anything about professional speakers. I'd never had the kind of a job that would have gone to meetings and seen speakers, but I just met a guy who was in that world. And so anyway, I'm doing that work, and all of a sudden I'm discovering this speaking world. And it was like, well, that's actually kind of interesting. I mean, they're on stage, there was enough of an overlap there with the experience of it. And I've always had this sort of small e evangelical impulse. I've always wanted to get up and, I'm that guy who wants to tell you what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Too much probably.
I know that
You know what
feeling.
I'm saying?
We
right?
both understand that.
Yeah. So it's like all of a sudden, that might be interesting to me. That might be something I could do. So that's just real generic, where I started to see that world and be sort of interested in it. And then I got involved with one particular client, this guy named John Miller, who's the lead author on the QBQ book you mentioned, Quest Behind the Question. And that relationship just sort of emerged kind of organically. I was just editing audio, and then I was offering some feedback on the content. And he started to say, well, maybe we should, you should help me more. And I started coaching him. And then we wrote some books together. And so what actually got me into the speaking world was the QBQ book was such a phenomenon. Like it's over 1 million copies sold now, which it's so rare.
Sure.
That there was so much demand for speaking for that. It was more than John could do. And I mean, John was the guy. It was a little more than a ghostwriter. We fashioned it together, but it was all in his voice. It was never intended for me to have an active role as far as the public in that. But we needed more, we needed more people.
Yeah.
So we kind of slowly worked me into I was like the JV QBQ speaker. If John couldn't make it or if they couldn't afford his fee, they'd send me out. So that's what got me on stage doing that kind of
Sure.
work. And that was super interesting. And my previous book was a communications book called Don't Just Talk, Be Heard. And that, okay, a little back up just a second. I'm getting an interest in this speaking world. I'm thinking, this is actually pretty satisfying. And it's a lot easier gig than showing up with all your gear.
Right.
You just show up to talk. That's pretty nice.
Yep.
So I was drawn to it. And I was talking to John about it. And he said, and so I said, the kind of things I'd like to talk about were really the early versions of this kind of material. So this really ended up, this material in Raise Your Inner Game is the stuff I've wanted to talk about from the beginning. Like even if the story in the book about how it all kind of turned around for me started in 92. And you can hear in my my first record, which I think I released in maybe 97. If you're listening, if you've read the book and you were listening to the material, you can tell I'm trying to share those same ideas.
Okay.
In the nascent sort of form.
Yep.
But so I'm kind of sharing that with John, and he says, what I think you should do is help people like you help me on the communication side. It's like, oh, okay, sure. You talk about being an artist, and one of the difficulties of the artistic life, I think, is that you're always hustling. You're always having to sort of ask and beg, and right, there's this, even though you've worked so hard to get so good, there's still this desperation in it because nobody inherently values what you're doing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
So when somebody says, here's what I think you should do, I'm like, great. That's a great idea. So I wrote that whole book, Don't Just Talk, Be Heard, and I got into doing speaking and training on the communication stuff. But then around 2010, I was kind of reminded that the message I really wanted to talk about, the material I wanted to talk about, was this more self-regulation, self-mastery stuff. And that got me back on this track. So that was a really long answer to your story, that it was the material, as far as how it affected me in my own personal life, that got me motivated, started way early, like 92-ish. The impulse to really finally get serious about putting into some material that I could bring out into the world and help others with. That started in earnest about 2010.
You made some references in there to Raise Your Inner Game. Can you walk listeners through? I mean, and it's really, and for listeners, I want to tell you that this is really easily digestible for a book of this caliber and this nature. I've read quite a few of these, and sometimes they get a little dense, they get a little wordy. This is not that book. This is a book that kind of cuts straight to the core of what David is trying to explain and help readers understand. But today I'm going to ask you, without spoiler alert, for readers of your book because I want them to buy it. Can you walk us through what Raising Your Inner Game is all about?
I can try.
Okay.
You'd think I could, so let's see how it goes.
Okay.
First, a couple sort of framework, sort of context things. The inner game is really just our inner life. It's our thoughts, it's our emotions, it's our physical state. And there's sort of a spectrum of what, like a state someone can be in from one moment to the next.
Mm-hmm.
At the top, those moments when we're at our absolute best, we just feel alive and excited and optimistic and creative. It's just us at our absolute best, and we feel great. And we've all had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
It happens now and then. At the other end of the scale is the times when we're at our absolute worst. We're frightened, we're angry, we're insecure, all that kind of, anxious, depressed, stressed out, overwhelmed. And most of the time, we're somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of moving around. Our state's kind of just shifting. We don't maybe pay attention to it all the time, but that's the reality. When you start to look, there's this range of states we can be in. And the biggest point in that observation is that where we are on that scale in any given moment is not normally something we have done intentionally. We're not in control of where we are. We're really almost completely controlled by what's going on around us, whether it's some internal thoughts and emotions or things that are happening in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We get upset by something, and now we're just upset for who knows how long, right? Indefinitely, until something else happens. We're trying to work on something, and a thought comes up that distracts us, and now we're off on that track, and we're not focused on where we need to be. And these things just happen to us, and there's just constant churn going on. So that's kind of what life is like normally for most of us. It's just like the nature of our lives, of human existence. And so the point of this book, of Raise Your Inner Game, is to learn to break that cycle, to learn to intentionally pick where you are on that scale. And of course, where we want to be is up at the highest part, at our best, right? That's where we're most effective, where we're most successful, and most important, where we actually feel the best.
Mm-hmm.
Really, everything we care about in our lives, those things that are really, really important to us, the feelings that we want, those all happen when we're up there. Mm-hmm. So the point of the book is to give people first sort of just the insight into how the system works, and then some real specific skills and tools to help them do that, to help them become more aware of where they are on this spectrum, and then learn to just get themselves where they want to be when they need to. So that's sort of the self-mastery idea.
Sure.
But the other element of that I want to say is that the idea of self-mastery, it's not like, okay, now I get it, and I'm there, and the struggles are gone. It's not a destination. The things that pull us off track, the distractions, the pressures, those are not going to go away. They're never going to go away, and they're probably just going to continue to get worse. I mean, the trend is up for all those kind of challenging factors in our lives. Mm-hmm. So the point isn't to try to get to a state where you don't have those struggles anymore. It's just to learn how to beat them, how to be able to consistently operate from your highest level whenever you need. And that's what the idea of the book is about. So it's broken into two parts. Part one is how the inner game works, which again is just having sort of a real clear sense of what's going on inside me now that's causing me to be in those other lower states where I really don't want to be. And then once you see that, once you click into that, then there's a set of just really simple, practical things you can do in the moment to break yourself out of there and get back up where you want to be.
One of the things that I found when I was reading your book was that I operate at a level 3 95% of the time. So
most people do. I mean, that is the nature of our lives. Yeah.
Right.
And
right.
to be fair,
we haven't talked about the levels.
We haven't
Yeah.
talked about the
Sorry,
levels.
we
But
haven't
no.
talked about the levels,
But that's
yeah.
okay. Let's use that. That's a perfect segue into it.
Let me just say a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we talked about the inner game is our inner life. In the book, I suggest that our total self is really made up of three main elements: physical, emotional, intellectual. And I want you to have a picture of a 4-story building to represent these levels. So when she said level 3, she was referring to the intellectual level. So it goes physical, level 1, emotional, level 2, intellectual, level 3. And then this Level 4 is that experience when you're at your best. So the goal is to try and operate from level 4 as much as possible. The reality is that we tend to be on the lower levels, and especially on level 3, meaning we're in our thoughts most of the time. We're going back and forth, right? And that's what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So tell us more about that.
Well, it's impossible for me to totally relax. So level 4 for me is being out of town on vacation with the family, walking the beach, reading a book that I want to read, doing things that I would really like to do that don't involve the things that I have to do in my work life or in my life that I don't want to do, like laundry or like, horrible tasks like that. So the only other time that I feel that I am reaching level 4 is when I'm at the gym and I've been warmed up for about 20 minutes. And then I have like 40 minutes of solid kettlebell swinging, whatever it is. It's the only other time that I find that my mind is no longer going to all of I have a to-do list in my head 24/7 relating to my family and work and all of these other things. And it's just constantly going.
Absolutely.
Even when I lay down at night, it's still going and it's tough. And so I want to get to level 4, 50% of the time would be great.
Let me tell you how.
Okay.
No, you already know how because you read the book. But the thing I really want to point out, first of all, those are perfect illustrations of the fact that we all have those level 4 experiences. Everybody has something where they feel like, this is great. This is just life feels really fully, vibrantly alive. The other thing I like to point out is that, when you dig a little bit to how you feel in those moments, everything changes. You're more optimistic about the world. The world is,
Yes.
It's hard to be optimistic,
Yes.
but within that range of possible, when you're in that experience, things are pretty good. I feel good. You're more confident about yourself. All those things are better when you're in that state.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing I really want to emphasize, and you've said it already, when you're doing those things, you're not thinking about those other things. So the level 4 state, we mentioned those sort of common experiences where it happens. But part of the reason we feel that way, it's not the experience itself. It's the fact that we're not in our head. It's the relief from being stuck on level 3 that brings that feeling. So the way to bring that into our normal lives is to sort of decouple that experience from the way it normally happens, again, like being in the gym, and just connect it to, my thoughts are quiet right now. That's really the core of it. And then learn to just do that, just to step back from that thinking experience, that obsessive thinking experience. And when you can do that, it's so much easier than it sounds, then you'll start to find that you are accessing, and all those feelings that you get from those other kind of experiences will start to filter into and show up in everything else you're doing. All those things that are less enjoyable or even stressful, conflict, being, time pressures. There's so many things that stress us out and pull us down that spectrum. Right. You can start to learn to just click out of those. There's Eckhart Tolle. Have you read Eckhart Tolle stuff? Mm-hmm. Speaking of new agey stuff that gets kind of dense, The Power of Now is a really, really important book for me. For this particular kind of idea, this idea of being present versus being off in your head on level 3. And he has this beautiful illustration of this. It's always stuck with me. So we've said, yes, we all tend to be stuck on this level 3. We're always going back and forth in our heads. And I think this is probably especially true of people who are in a higher accountability sort of life. Business owners, right? I mean, you can't just click out of that. You have to be in it all the time. So there's just a lot to hold and carry, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's exhausting. I think, Luke, you mentioned it's just exhausting to be there all the time. And that's a big part of that burden that so many of us feel. Life is just, God, it's just so much work. So Eckhart's point was, it absolutely is exhausting. And it makes total sense that people would naturally look for some relief from that. And so there are 2 ways to get relief from that. One is to move below. Mm-hmm. You check out. You get down into the emotional realm. You get down into the physical realm. You park yourself on the couch and you crack open a beer and you get some relief from that, right? And it makes total sense. And we shouldn't look down on that at all, because the impulse to get some relief makes sense. It does.
Yeah.
But the other way to do it is to go above it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this is about. Level 4 is about, okay, just learning to turn it off and just, oh my gosh. And again, it can sound sort of esoteric and hard to do, but it's the absolute easiest thing to do in the world once you kind of see it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So how this relates to small business development, right? I think that there is an acute self-awareness, and I can say as an entrepreneur, why people go into business, specifically businesses that are relatively mission-driven. The cafe, for example, we knew that there was a really high density of farmers and food producers in this region that we could spotlight and shine a light on and kind of use the restaurant as a vehicle for the growth of the community and the region. When we got into that, people say all the time, and I would say that the reasons that you get into business are not the reasons you stay in business, so to speak. There was the awareness and that, we are operating on a mission. And that for me is part of the level 4. That's when I feel the most drilled in. But the gravity pieces, the pieces that kind of pull you away from it, and one of the ones that I really want to talk about, because we highlight it all the time, like using social media as a tool to promote your business, specifically in its early stages. That requires a lot of intellectual thought, or in some cases, no intellectual thought. And it becomes this vision of who you are and what your business is that may not be actually grounded in reality. For entrepreneurs that are listening right now, David, how would you approach that specific piece? How do you project an image that is your highest self? At the same time, you're fighting all these external factors and trying to actually cultivate that image.
First of all, let me just say, the core of the Raise Your Inner Game book honestly does not speak directly to the question. It's really about self-regulation from one moment to the next. What can I do just in myself to resist the pressure, the gravity I'm feeling, and keep myself up where I want to be? That's really what the book is about. But still, I do think there's some good overlap in the question. One is exactly what you've done, is when you start out, be super clear on the why of it, on the mission of it. And the real key, and one of the things I think has made you so successful, Luke, is because it's your instinct, is to key into the emotional piece. Mm-hmm. What are you actually doing for people? What difference are you making for them emotionally? How do they feel differently after having done business with you than before? Right? That's the actual transformation. Almost nobody wants the thing you're actually selling or the service you're selling. They want the experiential, emotional outcome of having bought that or taken that service. So just as far as founding it in the beginning, mm-hmm. that is going to really help you dial into the why, and that why naturally brings the passion and the commitment and helps you feel good about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So you've got that as the founding principle of your business. And now you really want to make sure that that's as clear to people as possible. You want to have that be the filter and the marker for all the things you do, the name of your business, the things you call your products, the color schemes you use. I mean, it all needs to tell the same story. Or maybe a better way to put it is the more it does all tell the same story, the more effective it's going to be. So it's going to be clear to people what you're about, not just in the words you use, but in how you look, how your materials look, how you deal with them. And then the other thing, as far as helping over time, I think, is to start to collect and tell stories of your customer's experience with you. There's a lot of different ways to do that. It's not all just pure testimonial stuff. And I've heard this shared both from a marketing perspective. This one guy I follow, he just says, here's the story of your business. You create your product so that it helps people have results. You work with them. They get results. You capture their story. you share that story, and you rinse and repeat. And it's just this powerful upward cycle. The more results you give people, and the more you can capture those stories, that's the easiest marketing you'll ever do in your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
People actually talking about how you working with you has changed their lives. You don't have to sell anything. Just say, hey, let me share the story with you. And boom, and then you get more stories and you deliver more results. But it also works internally. As you grow and as the business gets bigger, and it's the challenge to make sure everybody in the team has the same vision for why we're really here, those same kind of stories have that effect internally also. They keep you focused on what you're really doing for people. The only real purpose for a business to be in the world is to make a difference for other people, right? And the bigger difference you make, the more comes back, which is where the money piece comes in. But it's really about the difference. So the more you can focus on that, and especially, again, I'll just say on the emotional element, because, and this ties back to the social media question. The problem with communicating electronically is that the emotional component gets filtered out. When we're together in person and communicating, dopamine is released. Mm-hmm. Also probably true in video, like live video. Mm-hmm. Through text communication, it's not. So just, social media, I mean, pictures can help, but still, by default, all of our electronic communications going out are devoid of an inherent emotional connection. Mm-hmm. So the way to fix that is to intentionally put it in. Mm-hmm. You've got to tell stories, and the stories need to speak to the emotion. Like if you're telling a story about someone who's worked with you, don't just say, their teeth doesn't hurt anymore. Talk about how much happier now they are. They were like, I was always cried with my kids because I had this toothache, but now I can really be with my kids, and bring out the emotional side of those stories. Mm-hmm. And that's really the best, I think the most effective and powerful way to counter that dehumanizing aspect of the social media.
Yeah.
And again, I would just keep folding that into all of your messaging and the positioning, and both external and internal.
So one of the things in the book that spoke to me was you had an anecdote about a friend of yours that was into licorice. Okay. So I'm into licorice too. So here's where this is interesting to me, especially with the moving between the levels. So I don't eat a lot of licorice because I know it's super high in carbs and yada, yada. We all know all of those things, as well as high in sugar. But if I could, I would have a room full of licorice and I would eat it all the time. I like black licorice. I like red licorice. I like red vines. I like Twizzlers. I like all of them. The organic stuff, it's all fabulous, right? So at one point in time, I was doing a Whole30. So you're not supposed to have any of that. And I went to Walgreens and I bought one of those huge bags of Twizzlers. And it was sitting on the seat, in the front seat with me in the car on the way home. And I'm on Highway 56 driving home. And I'm thinking about the licorice and I'm looking at the licorice. No licorice. Looking at the licorice. No licorice. Turning, looking. Eventually I open the bag. I eat some and I can't stop eating it. Literally cannot stop. So in order to get myself to stop eating the licorice, I end up having to take it out of the bag and throw it out of the car because that's the only way to do it. So that is me taking control over level 1 and 2 right there with level 3. But I wasn't happy about it. So I just wanted to say that particular anecdote in your book really spoke to me because I've been there with the licorice, eating all of the licorice, wanting to finish all of the licorice, and then having to literally take it out of the bag and dump it out the window. So I'm sure the raccoons or whoever really enjoyed the licorice that evening.
And now they're all jonesing
right.
for some more.
Yes,
that's a great example.
Man.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That's way more than I usually reveal about my licorice issues.
Here's the thing that makes me want to talk about. I hope I don't ramble too much, but we've talked about how we tend to be on level 3. I really think that's true pretty much by definition. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the human experience. And there's a certain amount of material out there on how to deal with that. But the thing you just talked about, the impulse control piece, and the longer I've been living with this material, even since the book's been out, I'm starting to see that the impulse control, which I'll define that as, it's the sort of, licorice is a good example. It's more of an unconscious pull to do something. Like when you first want that licorice, you're not necessarily thinking about it. It's just, right? Give, need, right? It's very unconscious. Yes. Now, the thinking clicks in later in the debate. Right? You got both. You've got, it's okay to have a little bit. There's that. There's reasons not to. But at its, the initial impulse is unconscious. And that learning to engage with those and get a handle on those, the impulses, is maybe even more powerful for getting you just feeling better in your life than the cognitive control, which is the level 3 kind of. I'm not saying that very well. Let me just back up for just a sec. There are 3 specific self-mastery skills that help you address breaking out of these 3 levels. The physical realm, level 1, is in the impulse realm. That's unconscious, and so that's called impulse control. The emotional realm, level 2, the skill to help you regulate that is emotional self-regulation. And this level 3 we're talking about, the intellectual level, the skill there is called cognitive control, which is really just being able to intentionally put your attention where you want it rather than having it float around the way it does. So this impulse control piece, getting a handle on these unconscious impulses, I'm getting more and more excited about it because, first of all, I realize that it's actually what I do most frequently during the day. If I'm feeling in a lower state, for whatever reason, there's all kinds of lower states. There's like negative lower states, like I'm bummed out or I'm depressed or I'm mad. And there's just somewhere I'm just kind of foggy and heavy and I'm just sleepy or whatever, right? There's a bunch of different experiences that are lower than level 4. But when I'm in one, the most reliable and quickest way to snap myself out of it is impulse control. So like, for example, I'll notice the licorice is out there and I'll catch myself reaching for it and I'll just say, no, and that's it. And it wakes you up in this really kind of magical little way. Or even less, because that's a tricky one because we know we're addicted to it, right? A smaller one, this comes up with me a lot, but I'm on a run and I've got my Fitbit on and about halfway through, and I do the same run every single day. I know exactly how long it takes. You know what I mean? I don't really need that data while I'm on the run, but I'll get this little impulse to just check the time. I wonder what time it is right now. And I'll say, no. It's not, whether I check it or not is not a big deal. It doesn't really matter at all. The big deal is, am I in this moment being intentional and aware and conscious, or am I acting unconsciously? When that impulse comes up to check your time and you just do it, it's an unconscious move. When you break that and just decide one way or the other, now you're awake. And that, when you get right down to the heart of it, that's really the essence of the level 4 experience. Right now, in this moment, are you deciding where your attention is at, what you're thinking about, how you're feeling, or are you just having all of that dictated by these unconscious things that are churning around inside of us? So your licorice story is good for me in a couple of ways. One, it brings up that whole idea of the importance of impulse control. It's hard to describe how profound that is when you get your head around it. The other is to say that, so you look at all these things in your life, all these different appetites and impulses and habits we have, and some of them will rise to a level. Licorice for you rises for one. You've got to get that out of the house, right? If it's around, it's too much.
It's gone.
If
it's around, it's gone. I'm going to eat all of it.
Exactly. I've never been a smoker. I've never had some of those classic big sort of addictions, so I can't really speak to them, but I can sort of imagine. And it's true for some people, like people in recovery. You can't have it around. But then there's the next level they get to. They can come to Thanksgiving dinner, and people can be having wine with their dinner, and they're okay with that, right? That's sort of a higher level of being able to have that impulse control. So the real point I want to make here is if you start to try and do this impulse control work, so what I mean is you just start to notice these little unconscious impulses you have, and you start to, in the book I call them lifts. It's a particular skill that you do where you start to notice little impulses and you just choose to resist them. Not because they're inherently good or bad or right or wrong, just because the act of being intentional in that moment is actually what perks you up to level 4. But as you do it, start with the little things, the things that have no real force over you. The smaller, the better. Checking your watch on your run, picking up the scrap of paper off the floor. And the reason you can start there is because the mechanism of gravity, if you will, these forces that pull us off track, that's kind of the big picture story we're talking about, right? We want to be on level 4, and there are all these things happening that keep pulling us away from that. So the mechanism of that of how that happens is in these tiny little moments, something comes up and we unconsciously go with it. That's all it is. So you can, as you start to observe these moments and resist that pull with these small things that are really easy to do, there's no real big debate about them. What you're doing is you're building that muscle. It's like you're going to the gym and you're doing that particular move. And even though it's a small thing, it's the same move. When you get later you decide to tackle the licorice, and you can have so for me, my thing is Coke Zero. And by the way, I said earlier, I think at the beginning, that self-mastery is not about a destination. It's an ongoing struggle. I've been writing about this struggle with Coca-Cola or Coke Zero now since 1992, and I'm still getting beat by it as often as not. Okay, so it's not a destination. It's a way of living. But in the times when I'm feeling better or I'm demanding a little bit more of myself, because I've got some. Let me step back a little bit. I talked earlier. I said the goal of learning this material, of raising your inner game, is that you can get yourself to the level you want, which is basically level 4, no matter what's going on in your life. Sometimes our needs for that are higher than others. If I'm on a creative deadline, when I was trying to get this book written, for example, to really do some, what I would consider high-level creative work, basically to get the best you can possibly do, it's sort of like an athlete in the on-season versus the off-season. You know, during the season, they have to get themselves into absolute peak shape. And in the off season, they can dial it back a little bit. So that's every bit as true for me in my creative life, and I think it's true for everybody. There were some times in your life where your inner game has to be absolutely at its best. And in those times, I'll say, okay, no Coke, you just can't do it. You can give yourself no latitude with all this impulse kind of stuff. So when I'm in that kind of a zone, what I was getting at was, we got a fridge in the basement. My office is in the basement of our house. We've got a second fridge down there. And we've got the Licorice in there, and the Coke is right next to it. And when I'm in one of these states, it's absolutely not a problem for me. I can just reach in. It's like 2 inches over to the Coke versus the Licorice. And I can just grab the Licorice, and it's almost no effort at all when I'm kind of in that zone. And that, I think, is because I've been able to, again, take these little ones and build them up and build them up and build them up. Now, having said that, these last couple of weeks, I've been really tired. I've been having some sleep stuff. There's a ton of stuff going on. And I don't have any super high demands on my creative output. So I'm slacking a little bit on my expectations of myself. I think I've only had one day in the last 3 weeks where I didn't have a Coke of some kind. And by the way, in my defense, this is my only source of caffeine. So that's the big argument. I wake up in the morning and I go, oh, no, this is a caffeine day. I just have to have it today. But anyway, that was sort of a rambling response to the licorice story. But it's super important. This impulse control thing it's like the golden ticket for people to kind of break into this world, just starting to recognize these impulses and starting to resist them intentionally. And by the way, one more little thing if I can, because you can get hung up on this pretty easily. I mentioned the thing with my watch. It's easy to look at that example and say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, it's just checking the time, right? And the point I want to make is that's exactly right. It doesn't matter whether you do it or not. Either way is fine. The enemy, if you will, is not which choice you make. It's whether you made it intentionally or you made it unconsciously. Mm-hmm. That ultimately is really the key to the level 4 experience. Am I being fully present, or am I kind of in this sleepwalking mode? And even with a silly little thing like checking your watch, technically it is a sleepwalking mode if you just do it unconsciously. Another example from a run, I'm running along and all of a sudden I get this impulse to stop. I'm kind of tired, you know? And a lot of times if I'm not thinking about it, I'll just stop. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I'm walking. How did that happen? You know? And other times I'll notice it and I'll just consider it. I'm noticing this feeling that I should stop. Should I or not? You know? And neither one is correct. Some days I'll say, you know what, I really am kind of sore. Maybe I should. Other days I'm like, no, I'm fine. Just let's keep going. So back to the point. Both those answers could be fine. It's never about, from the perspective of the inner game, the question is never what you're doing. It's who's in charge of that moment. Are you deciding what you say and think and do, or are you just kind of unconsciously sleepwalking into it? And this impulse control stuff is a really great way in. The level 3 stuff, the cognitive control, is super powerful and effective, but sometimes it's a little harder to see because we're so inside it. You both have said already, like 95% of my time, I'm in my head, right? So it can take a little harder, a little more time, especially in the busyness of the day, to even just remember what's going on there. But these impulses are easy to see sometimes, and so they can be a really effective tool for people.
Do you feel like since you wrote Raising Your Inner Game, or really started thinking about these 4 levels, does that make you much more proactive in your life as opposed to reactive? And does that feeling like give you a semblance of control? Because I can say as an entrepreneur or as a creative artist, creative mind, a lot of what I will intend to do is very proactive, right? I'll intentionally bring myself down to level 2 or level 1 even sometimes. Let's have a fight or flight situation and react from that and use that as rocket fuel to fuel the art of what we're doing. But then all the fallout from maybe it's the pressure or maybe it's the backlash of putting yourself at those levels and opening yourself up to that experience takes away control. And that for me is where emotionally, physically, intellectually, I start to fall into traps. And a lot of these traps are traps that I've set for myself or through, over the basis of time, my body is patterned to such a response. But do you feel like actually applying the principles of Raising Your Inner Game gives you control?
Maybe more than anything else. Now, I hesitate to use that word as I describe the material, and it might just be me, but I feel like it has a negative connotation to it, that we're turning ourselves into, robots, or it's about sort of power, and it's none of those things. Mm-hmm. It's self-control, right? It's not control of others.
Right.
It's control of ourselves, because my experience is that almost without exception, when I look back on having been coming from one of the other levels, I never feel good about it. I mean, it can be a tool. Mm-hmm. And one thing I should say, too, just distinguish a little bit, this level 3, the thing we're talking about, it's the thinking realm. Some of the pushback you get sometimes, or the confusion around it, is that people will think, the suggestion is that they shouldn't be thinking, that there's bad about something thinking, and that's not it at all. Mm-hmm. It's, again, comes back to the intentional versus unconscious. Thinking is our absolute highest capacity. It's the thing that distinguishes us from all the other species, right? Everything beautiful and great that we've ever created is a result of creative, innovative thinking. So it's fantastic as a tool. The problem comes when it's in control all the time and you're just in your thoughts all the time, whether you want to be or not, because most of them are not that helpful.
Right.
So I actually have this image in my mind of when I think about the power and the good of thinking. It's like a tool. Literally, I'll picture it like a hammer on the workbench. And when I've got some work that needs that tool, I've got to do some thinking about something, I've got to solve something, great. I pick it up, I do the work. But when I'm done, I set it back down. You don't need to be a slave to your thinking all the time. But So when I am a slave to it, whether it's thinking or I'm in an emotional hijack sort of state, or I'm in a kind of state that comes from a level 1 state, which is usually, really base and driven by some sort of almost a primal sort of survival sort of impulse, I never feel good about it. I always feel less proud of myself. The things that I've probably done that were the most, things I probably don't tell anybody about, the deepest kind of shame I hold, all comes, without exception, from having been acting from one of those levels. Mm-hmm. So one of the best things about doing this work is the more you can come into an upsetting situation, for example, a typically sort of upsetting situation, and not get overwhelmed by it. And you'll feel that upset, you'll feel that fear, whatever it is, but you're able to sort of click out enough and still be present and still engage with it as best you could. You start to really, truly feel better about yourself, proud of yourself. Not because you've been great in some way, but you just know how much worse it could have been.
Right.
You know what I mean? You have all this memory of times when you've let things get you and you've reacted in a way that you regretted. Less regret is better. The more you can do things where you feel, that went as good as it could have. Mm-hmm. Whether, say it's a creative thing. Damn, I'm really proud of that. That was really, I'm tickled by what I came up with.
Yeah.
Right? That only happens if you can have enough focus and intention with your energy and your creative impulses to dig deep and find those things. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, when you're dealing with things that are really difficult, it gives you a sense of pride. And that pride, back to your question, comes directly from that sense of self-control. Well, another simpler way to put it, I just feel like more of a grown-up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I really do. When I see myself acting, driven by emotion, driven by fear, driven by negative thinking, I think I see that person as being immature, mm-hmm. as being just grow up, And so the more I'm able to do this stuff, just in my own experience, I start to, a little bit over time, think, you know what, I do kind of feel like a grown up now.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's so much good stuff in Raise Your Inner Game, and it really is one of those pieces that if you can take a step back and look at how you are acting and reacting on a daily basis, this is really, really helpful and really useful information to even hold. Even if it's just for contemplation purposes, it's really significant, and it gives you the power to do exactly that. Make those decisions and make them in a way that you choose to make them, which is really empowering. We're with author David Levin, author of Raise Your Inner Game. David, where can listeners pick this book up?
Actually, there's a great offer going on in the book now. The book is actually available for free. You pay $7 shipping and handling.
Wow.
And you also get an extra free video training that goes with it, trying to get a little more out of the book. So the direct one is raiseyourinnergame.com, just one word, raiseyourinnergame.com. You can also see a link to that from my site, davidlevin.com.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, we
it was
really
a treat.
appreciate it.
It was a treat.